Today's first panel interrogates the idea of the newscast itself and all of its traditional structures and customs as possibly not the best way to move forward for the industry to find and grow new audiences. Our panelists today are working on the front lines of this issue, and they're tasked with testing and implementing changes to traditional formats. It's my pleasure to introduce them now. Micah Gelman is the Senior Editor and Director of Editorial Video for The Washington Post. Socrates Lozano is the Senior Director of Scriptscast and Newsroom Innovation for the EW Scripps Company. Meredith McGinn is the EVP of Diginets and Original Production at NBC Universal Local. Sarah Burke is VP and News Director of WCBS here in New York. And Sam Peterson is the COO of Bit Central. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with the premise of this panel, and I would like each of you to speak briefly to this question. Is the traditional newscast in need of blowing up? Are the premises correct here? And whatever you're thinking is, what is your reasoning? Let's start with Socrates.
Yeah, is it in need of blowing up? I think it's in need of modernizing and like adapting and just, catering the newscast experience to a modern audience. And I think if you go into any of our archives across any of our newsrooms around the country and pop in a tape from 1970, not a lot has changed as far as like format goes, and I think that there's a really big opportunity in front of us to kind of figure out what the new age of that should look like.
Meredith?
So it's critical that we innovate and experiment. We've been doing that with Alex News, trying some really bold, radically different formats, storytelling styles, graphically driven, leaning into cinematic journalism. And at the same time, we are growing audiences with LX News, but it's been interesting in our division. This year we launched 15 streaming news channels. These are linear channels leveraging all of the legacy newscasts for all of our NBC and Telemundo stations, and we are seeing tremendous impressions on those channels. So clearly, viewers appreciate and come to the traditional legacy newscasts. We just need to find the viewers where they're going and make it more convenient for them. We're seeing time-shifted viewing. They'll watch our morning newscast later when we're in national news on the main channels. So it's important to experiment, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. Sam?
Yeah, I think the word Socrates used the word adapting. And I think that is what I think about a lot, is adapting to the audience. As Meredith said, where is the audience? What are they watching on? What does the audience look like? And I think in the world today, it's not just appointment television. It's not just sitting down in front of a CRT at home. So it's what does it look like to adapt that content and to adapt in the format of the way we put the content together. And is there an opportunity there also to tell the stories individually differently because that distribution looks different? So adapting, I think that is a really wise way to think about it.
Sarah?
I agree with everything that my fellow panelists have already said in terms of the need to innovate and adapt. This is a great and exciting opportunity to look at what can be done to modernize what we're offering from both a format of the newscast perspective, but also from a storytelling perspective. And I think that's something that we can do now to keep viewers coming to us in the future. The nice thing is local news is still one of the most, if not the most, trusted source of news. And so, to Meredith's point, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, there's a lot of really good things that are happening with local news, but the call to innovate and to experiment in the storytelling and the way we format our newscasts, I think, is very clear. And there's a great opportunity with streaming to do a little experimentation while still offering the traditional tried and true newscast.
Micah?
I guess I would say I'm probably the least qualified person on the panel to answer this question, because the last newscast I produced was in 2005 at WJZ in Baltimore. But I'm still a believer in the newscast as a rallying point, as a moment. I think it's, for me personally, the pandemic kind of reintroduced me to sitting down and watching the nightly news and the local news. And, I find that to be a really helpful come together moment where I'm inundated with things all day long, but here's someone who can help put it in context. So I believe the newscast should live on, but I also agree with everyone on the panel that the ability to go find the viewers other places is really critical, and experimentation in formats that may attract new viewers as well.
So Micah, you just indicate you do have a background in TV, but you are the odd man out here in that you're representing a newspaper, the Washington Post, which produces a number of hours of daily video, iterating not only on its own sites and apps, but there's also a streaming channel right now on View It, although that's sort of the live events as we distinguish, not quite from the same as what would be on the website. But you are part of the competition, you're part of this ecosystem. So from the standpoint of innovation, do you think that being outside of the TV news world gives you a competitive advantage in the sense that you're not saddled with the same conventions as everybody else here might be?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is a great advantage for us. We have basically a blank sheet of paper every day, and we can do what we want for it. That's also can be incredibly challenging because there's no guide rails. And so you have to balance, the ability to innovate. And what I tell my team is, when we're going to go do a story, I don't want to talk about what that's going to look like. Let's go look at and do the story and figure out what's the best format to take. Is that a mini doc? Is that an interactive? Is that a series? Is it largely written text with series of looping GIFs or something that help to illustrate it? So we really, it's great not to be dialed into having a minute-and-a-half package, but it also, it can be incredibly frightening at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't have the burden of the obligation of a 5 o'clock newscast to produce,
Absolutely
so that
not.
liberates you enormously.
Yeah.
But that said, I think everyone would find it interesting to get a picture of what the video objectives are at the Washington Post. Just what is in your sights? What's the trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, we are producing an incredible amount of video daily, and not just my team, but the live events team as well, with newsmaker interviews. We have built up a team that does live breaking news. So at the moment, we have live anchored coverage of the FTX hearing that's happening. We thought SBF would be there, but apparently not. So big tentpole moments, election nights, debates, conventions, the funeral of the Queen, that type of
Insurrections.
coverage. Insurrections, yeah. Gives us an opportunity to become that rallying point that I talked about, right? Like, our main anchor, Libby Casey, is, for all intents and purposes, the face of the Washington Post. And, I think newspapers are just figuring out what TV news has known for a long time, is that people come because of the personalities. They come because they trust the anchor. They trust their local anchor. They trust Lester Holt or Nora O'Donnell, And so newspapers didn't really understand this, I think, until much more recently. And so we're actually making a concerted effort to build up some personality. And I think that's, for us to attract subscribers and return, viewers or readers, we have to have that personal connection that I think TV news obviously has understood from the start.
Socrates, you work out of Scripps' National Content Hub in Denver, and part of your remit there has been to question everything that we know about making TV news. What elements of the newscast, when you look at that and you do that assessment, what elements do you think we should be done with this? We should be getting rid of this part.
Yeah, one of the things that we've learned is, a successful content strategy doesn't just happen, right? And I think it's really important that everybody is involved in that process. But as far as like what needs to change or adapt in an actual show, is I think a lot of the show is controlled by a singular producer. And so generally it's one producer that's sitting down and kind of working on a show alone. They have kind of like editorial discretion over that show. I believe that in order to improve the quality of our products is we have to figure out a way to make that process more collaborative. So that there's, you look at, what makes communities good and what makes communities strong. And I think that's diverse opinions from multiple perspectives. And I think that that's also really important to incorporate in our newscasts. And the way that you do that is by involving more people in that process. So figuring out a workflow and a way to make a newscast collaborative so it's not centrally being produced by just one producer. And I know that's a very broad thing to say, but it's ultimately, the photographer that's shooting the story, the MMJ that's putting together a separate story. It's the reporter that's maybe writing another piece of content in the story. Like, I think that opening up a newscast to the whole newsroom will make a very strong product that your community will be able to relate to.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Have you found that because of the pandemic and having more virtual meetings, is that process more open now? Are you having people join meetings who perhaps didn't in the past?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we do different at the national team is anytime we have any sort of meeting or virtual, everybody has to participate in the process. So whether you're a graphics designer or an editor, everybody has kind of a voice and a say. We also have kind of a hard and fast rule that if you don't feel like you're able to participate, you need to get up and walk out of the room if you're not contributing. And so I think we try to create an overall culture of safety, and I think the pandemic has definitely opened that up and made people a little bit more comfortable with participating and sharing. Because in a normal newsroom, you've got the most common kind of loud voices in the newsroom, and it's kind of hard to open that up and to have that process, the editorial process, be more collaborative. And so yes, I think we have noticed that as a big benefit.
So I hear you about broadening it, having more points of view in the construction of the show, but just in terms of an easy throw out, like the anchor toss to the reporter, or that kind of dynamic, or is there any one thing when you look at the whole entirety of a newscast, you're like, this is just, we've been doing it so long, we have no good reason to do so.
Yeah, the role of an anchor, I think, needs to change. Primarily most shows are put together with an anchor that's at the center of the show. And I think that needs to adapt and change. I think what makes us strong as a journalism company is the fact that we have community expertise. And the way that you do that is by modifying your content strategy to get your anchors out in the field more and being part of that community. And then having that feeling and getting credit for it by having your anchors out in the field a lot more so that your viewers can relate to it. But I think the role of an anchor traditionally, intro tag, that is an opportunity that definitely needs to change.
Well, we have some anchors here later today. We will ask them to account for themselves entirely during that. Just one other thing. People are interested. These hubs and labs are popping up in groups around the country. And so at yours, what's your own focus in terms of starting to create anew then? Are you starting, in terms of the product, are you starting with the stories themselves? Are you looking at the newscast, the whole architecture of the system? Where does your innovative eye focus?
Yeah, I always say oftentimes technology can get in the way of innovation sometimes in the creative process. And so my own personal philosophy is what I'd like to always focus in on is what are we trying to accomplish from a content standpoint? And then we work backwards to the technology. Because oftentimes it's when you want to do something new, it's we can't do this because we don't have X, right? Or we don't have Y or Z. And so conceptually, when you're talking about new concepts or new content strategies, generally speaking, I always like to just focus on, what are we trying to do here? What differentiation are we trying to kind of create? And then we figure out, okay, now what technology infrastructure do we either buy, invest, or build to make this content experience, sing?
Sort of backwards by design, really. Meredith, LX News is a big part of your portfolio for several years. Obviously, it's been the lab in which NBC's done some of its most creative work in innovating news. We have showcased a lot of that work previously in TV News Check, in stories and videos. What I'm interested in today is how that work is now having a broader impact across your individual stations, where I know you have LX people, kind of a point person at many of the stations, or all of the stations. Is LX's work now coming out of the silo of the lab and starting to change things substantively in the evening news or the nightly news?
In some respects, it's just more boots on the ground. We've had some of our beat reporters for LX News in politics, in climate, be able to do many stories that have been pushed out across all of our stations, live shots for Hurricane Ian, things like that. But I mentioned earlier, the cinematic journalism has been, a good roadmap for how we can tell stories in a much more digital-friendly way. What we're also seeing, because with LX News, we don't necessarily have conventions around a required length for a story. Some of our stations have seen that example and taken it to new experimentation. In San Diego, they changed the first block of their late news to be a deeper dive into a single topic or to feature that longer form investigative piece that normally you wouldn't have at that time. And they've been #1 ever since they made that bold change. We've also tried fewer commercial segments and less commercial time in general. So then when we launched a new newscast in Miami, we followed the same convention and saw longer length of tune and higher AUR.
Can you've mentioned the cinematic journalism a couple of times. Can you elaborate on what that looks like?
Sure. So, if you think of the beautiful documentaries you may watch on cable TV, we're modeling that style, but doing it in far, far less time than cable documentaries. We had one of our amazing storytellers go to his hometown of San Angelo, Texas, and shoot a full documentary in 4 days that was not just an incredible, impactful story about the COVID pandemic debate in that town and how it was really tearing the town apart, but it was done in a very first-person docu-style.
How long was that?
It ended up being an hour.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we showcased it in multiple shorter form segments.
Sarah, you are a news director in the biggest market in the country. You have an enormous volume of day turn work to be done. So how are you able to pragmatically think about innovating the news product at all? How do you have any room to tackle it? And if you are doing it, can you give us a kind of practical, specific example of how that might happen in the volume of work you have to do?
Yeah, the pace at which we are turning out newscasts is probably the greatest single challenge to innovation. So we're looking for opportunities when we can take them, smart risks that allow us to innovate. Probably the most recent example is the 10th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy was earlier this year. And we took that as an opportunity to dig through our archive material and to teach multiple photographers, many of whom had some background in shooting kind of that cinematic style that Meredith was referring to create a documentary using our archival footage and then going out and conducting interviews with many of the people who survived the storm and had just still very traumatic recollections of what had happened. The documentary, I was thrilled with how it turned out, but really the lasting impact of that experimentation and the time and money spent is that we have showed our newsroom what we can do and what we will do to innovate the content for the future. It won't always be a 1-hour documentary, which is what the Sandy documentary ultimately ended up being, but it can be a 15-minute or a 10-minute, and it's really gotten people thinking about the future of our content in exciting ways. And one of the conversations I've had repeatedly with my team members is, we can still do day of news and think creatively about how we storytell in the future. The two can live together in a newscast and allow us to be engaging to a modern audience and still serve our tried and true viewers and live up to what is expected of a local news channel.
Do you think every newsroom needs that person to show the way, to show by example, and so everyone else can say, wait, we're allowed to do that?
Well, I think it really helps. We've been at this a long time, and so we have a lot of seasoned veterans, of course, here in New York, more so than most markets probably. And so to take the opportunity and say, hey guys, this is something we should be trying, and by the way, mistakes are expected. Like, this is experimentation, this is new ground. So to take some risks means they're not all gonna pay off, but fail fast, get back up and try the next new thing, and then use data to measure your success.
Sam, you are the news technologist here, and you've got a product at Bit Central called Fuel that essentially enables your clients to produce a story, and you can immediately get it into rotation on their websites or apps, essentially enabling a sort of de facto newscast to be built continuously in increments. How does this tool reflect how TV newsrooms maybe ought to be thinking about the nature of a newscast itself?
The premise behind Fuel originally, and I think this has played out relatively well, has been that we do have now this differing platform, this different distribution method that we can experiment with a little bit. And we know that I'm not having to place this big bet at the 11 p.m. news where thousands, 10,000s, significant audience. And so I can connect in a different way with the audience and put together something that maybe it's not formatted exactly like a newscast, but format a set of stories together for a particular presentation for a particular viewer on a particular device. And that has played out well for us and for our customers to be able to do just that, experiment, and think about what that presentation looks like. And think about both the audience from a demographic perspective, from the geographical perspective, but also what the device type is. Are they watching on mobile? Are they watching on a connected television? So I think that experimentation piece, putting the technology in the hands and loosening some of these bonds a little bit of thinking that I have to format a rundown, and granted that has worked remarkably well for decades and it still will continue to work for a very long time, but for a differing audience, can I think about that a little bit differently, particularly as the way the presentation works? How do I put those stories together into something that feels linear?
Mm-hmm. So how does technology like this liberate TV news from outmoded approaches to production?
That's a good question. At the technology level, I think there's two sides of it. One is the presentation, but I think for all of us, particularly most of the technology in this room, it's also at the gathering and storytelling level. And how do we not get in the way so that innovation can happen? We heard on the panel too. Oftentimes, as technologists and technology providers, we can make life harder for those that are trying to tell that story. That's not necessarily our aim, but that has happened. And so what do we do to make those tools simple enough, certainly as particularly journalism, there are a lot more people telling those stories, and even at the technical level, MMJs and otherwise. And so how do we put that in front of them that they can, make mistakes, fail fast, but also produce content quickly, yes, but thoughtfully. And I think that's the real challenge, is how we have both of those things happen at the same time. Thoughtful journalism, but also have it keep the pace that we all expect.
I want to focus a little bit on the TV news story itself and where some of you are playing with the conventions there. Photography has already come up a little bit, and Socrates, your background is in news photography, so I know you've been playing around with the idea of how stories are shot. So how have you been able so far to take a fresh look at the way the cameras that you're using, the way where you're putting the camera?
Yeah, I think it's really important to modernize our storytelling. I think we see some good examples from LX at NBC, but you have to cater your content to what's relevant today. And I'm sure the majority of you in the audience today watches a lot of documentaries across the group, and so I think the audience has grown accustomed to watching content in that way, and they've come to also expect it in some cases. And I think that there's a huge opportunity in matching the equipment that some of those documentaries are shot on, and also teaching our people within our newsrooms on how to properly care for it, run it, and what's the proper workflow to be able to output the highest quality in the shortest amount of time, because everyone's working towards that deadline. And I believe that both are possible. You can have a really high quality product and you can turn it out relatively quickly, but you also have to adhere to a specific workflow that's really important. And I think one of the best ways to maximize that is to be able to, go and approach a story as a team. And so, we used to have a rule where if you have a photographer, you have to make it worth it. And a lot of MMJs have the ability to shoot, and so the expectation from the script side is that they team shoot that together. And so a lot of people don't know how to shoot as a team, and so as managers or as people who run organizations, like, it's our jobs and our duties to figure out and to kind of build training to teach our people the newest way and what success actually looks like in this space. But I think it's critical that we experiment with our storytelling and modernize it, like documentary style storytelling. We also call that first person storytelling, where the reporter or the photographer or anybody that's producing the story is walking that viewer through what that story is in a very clear way. And again, the ultimate goal here is to make platform agnostic content. So whether it's running on YouTube or fast channels or over the air on broadcast, the goal is that you're creating the content in a way that serves multiple purposes, instead of creating content one way that then has to have a team of 12 people that are basically repurposing that content and creating it for other platforms. There's a lot of things about that are very inefficient, and so a lot of that starts with the photography, and then it just kind of runs its course throughout the organization.
I'm interested in that atomic level of innovation. LX, obviously, Meredith has done a whole lot of that. Is there any other example you might want to speak to, or other kind of general patterns that you're tending to follow that's attacking the story at that level?
We're always super focused on being conversational. So we rarely have voiceover in our pieces. If the reporter or storyteller is speaking to the audience, often it's a different framed shot than what you're used to in a typical reporter story. And it's directly talking to you in a very deliberate conversational way to make the content more meaningful, more approachable, and to hopefully get through the passion and the importance of the story.
Yeah, I just want to point out that NPR did this years ago with Planet Money, which is still a big franchise for them, which they took these really complicated economic subjects and made it a discussion between two journalists, which made it much more palatable and sort of you could follow it better. I don't know if it's always possible to have two journalists, though, talking to each
Right.
other, if that's pragmatic on screen.
Well, that's something else that we do frequently. We'll leverage the NBC station reporters or our Telemundo station reporters and have them on for a debrief, which in some respects is liberating for them, because it's a very different, in some respects more casual format, much more conversational, often delivering urgent news, but in a more approachable way.
This is a question, anybody can jump on this, but Socrates, it sort of speaks to something you just brought up a moment ago in terms of the modularity of the news story. Do we need to unshackle the news story from the newscast and basically make everyday stories better able to stand on their own as independent units without an anchor setup or a package, getting kind of a needless live setup from a reporter in the field? And if we do need that, how can we move toward that as a goal? Anyone can take that.
Yeah, I think by changing our newsrooms little by little, I don't think things are going to change overnight, but I definitely think the importance of a story is no longer just valued at the 5 p.m. newscast. So I've got a minute 30 story. I think our approach to storytelling should be, are we telling the right stories, and do we have enough perspectives in the story to make it good so that our viewers can benefit from it? I think it's just going to take time to get there, but I definitely think because there's so many different platforms, no longer are people waiting around for the 5 p.m. newscast to get started. I think, the life cycle of a story is much longer than that, and especially on certain platforms, it's years. That life cycle is years. And so I think it's really important that we not only build our content to stand on its own, but I also think that it's also equally important to figure out how that practically works in a newsroom. So, across the country, you don't shock your whole entire newsroom to change it. I think it's it's just an evolving strategy that I think is really important and critical for our survival as an industry.
Does anybody else want to take that?
Yeah, I would add that our philosophy is we have to be very platform specific when we tell stories. And we can't use one thing in multiple places. So, for example, we launched yesterday a deeply reported, over a year of reporting series on the rise of fentanyl and the missed opportunities to reduce that in text, in photography, in video. But those videos, some of them were made just for YouTube. Some of them were shorter and more interactive and just moments for our site. And some of that storytelling was just for Instagram and told in a way that is vertical. We have invested significantly in vertical video storytelling because that's how people are consuming our journalism now, much more than they are in the kind of legacy formats, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram. And so our view is we have to be really platform specific. And we've taken a bit of a different approach than Socrates talked about, is that we have experts in how to tell stories on Instagram or how to tell stories on TikTok. So we're not necessarily expecting one person to be the expert or the team that is doing the reporting to really know how to attract an audience on those platforms. So we're relying on the people who own those platforms to be, to be the experts in how to get that story across.
I think there's great internal, or it seems to me from the outside, there's great internal industry debate on versioning, whether the answer is create the thing that is ultimately modular and doesn't need to be versioned, which takes so much time to do and so much labor effort, as opposed to the need for, which cues up the next question I have for you, Micah, about TikTok. I mean, where Washington Post has 1.5 million followers. I wonder where platforms like that and YouTube are showing the industry perhaps where it should be heading, and what are some of the, just briefly, the salient storytelling or structural elements there that TV news can learn from there? Because obviously you figured something out with 1.5 million people, and there are barely any news organizations, relatively speaking, on TikTok.
There are a few now. I think there are organizations, USA Today, NBC, that have really have been successful. I mean, for us, TikTok was born of failure. We had a really talented producer who was trying to do some lighter storytelling, which we all felt was necessary after the 2016 election, on YouTube, and spent a year trying to do that. His name is Dave Jorgensen. And it just was not taking off, and he had this idea, that maybe he would be better on TikTok, and this was 2019-ish, so well early in that, in the life cycle so far of TikTok. And, in traditional Washington Post style, wrote a 6-page memo explaining why he should be on TikTok, which I think had a lot of pictures, actually, so it wasn't all text. And, it sat on my desk, and I kind of thought through the process of what it would take to get approval to launch a TikTok channel, and decided that was way too exhausting, so we're just going to do it and keep it on, the down low, which lasted maybe an hour. And so it was born of that, fail fast future. And now he's got a 3-person team. It's incredibly successful from a sales perspective as well. Although the platform doesn't generate revenue directly, we have a lot of interest in kind of the content studio side, producing ads for us on there. And so, this is, one of the ways you have to get, my view is like, if people have good ideas, my job is like to get out of the way, right? Is to like find them the money or the time, but just like get out of the way, because they know what they're doing. And that's, Instagram is in much the same way, and so we've taken those learnings back onto Washington Post. So if you come to the Washington Post app, you will find a carousel of vertical videos that would look at home on Instagram or TikTok, and you scroll through them the same way. And, that is the genius of our product team, and, their ability to take learnings and bring them back. And that's driven incredible engagement and lengthy viewing in a way that, putting the video on top of the article doesn't necessarily do.
Right, right.
I've got a question. Could you walk us through like the editorial conversations that you guys had? It seems like it was very grassroots. You're like, let's just launch this thing. But then when it started gaining traction, give us a peek into what conversations were being had at the Washington Post about, like, is this journalism? Should we keep this? And what ultimately was the driver to continue the mission and push forward creatively with that TikTok channel?
Sure. So, and I don't know if the debate is completely settled. I think there are probably some people who are like, what are we doing here? But the idea was, the thing you're not working on is not working. Let's try this. It's, I at the time thought it was a low visibility thing, and just through Dave's sheer force of personality and intellect and knowledge of the platform, very quickly we knew it was something that was going to be exciting. And so and we very deliberately, I'd say the first 8 months or so, he'll obviously correct me on the timeline, we didn't do news. It was really just building personality. It was building his personality on the site. And then when the pandemic happened and George Floyd, we saw this as a moment where we really needed to be in the news cycle. And as we built this entire following, and then as the Post began focusing on the importance of personalities, in, as I said, typical Washington Post style, we wrote another 6-page memo. This one went to Mr. Bezos, and he was, all for the experimentation. So now we have 3 people who are working on the platform, and bringing those learnings back to the rest of it. And now we have everybody in the newsroom wants to be on it, right? Everybody wants to be in on it, and so that's how that conversation went.
And Michael, one quick note about your point regarding versioning. The proof is in the data. We have to look at the data, and unfortunately, some of the traditional TV reporter pieces just don't deliver the audience, particularly when we're talking about short-form vertical video type platforms.
But also, yeah, if you format the product from the start in a way that's more engaging, it's easier to version. But again, it starts at the storytelling level and then works its way to all the different platforms.
Just a couple of quick things I want to hit on before we're kind of coming up against our time. Sarah, I just want to ask you about data reporting. We were talking about it just a bit before. Data reporting, data visualization is playing a larger role in video news generally. I'm wondering how it can and is starting to play a role in reshaping what a newscast or a news show looks like, and maybe how, at a specific newsroom, you ought to be thinking about the role of data more. How are you thinking about that at WCBS?
Well, we're lucky enough to have recently added a data journalist to our team through our innovation lab, which we were talking about. But I think data reporting adds so much credibility to everything that we do and really answers the question why and puts things into the right context for our audience. So we'll be undertaking the process of onboarding this new resource to the team, and I think the biggest challenge for us in this moment is to help our culture, our newsroom culture, understand all the value that can be derived from having this person in the newsroom, and then how to visualize it, which is also another challenge because data can be very interesting, but quickly turn boring if it's on a bunch of full screens or pie charts. So that'll be our next step, is to make it really engaging for the audience on all of our platforms to dig into data. But to get to the kind of core of your question, why does it matter and why would we be leaning into data right now? And I think it goes to the fundamental issue of trust and transparency. And to be able to cite data in our reporting builds on the trust, builds more trust in our reporting. and I think helps with the transparency piece too. We can break down data. I think you saw a lot of that in the pandemic. Some of the best anchors who helped people get through the early days of the shutdown were doing so by standing, and really breaking down the numbers and helping people understand how the virus was spreading. So I think actually COVID did a lot for data because people became like armchair experts in data, and so it's hugely important right now.
And as far as data visualization goes, I just shout out to LX for doing some of the best that I've ever seen in that regard, really creative applications of that. We're coming up against our time, so I just lastly would like to go around the group and ask each of you to name one technology that you're using now that is having or you think will have a transformative effect on how video news is made. Micah?
Wow. I don't know how you can answer that because it's not one technology. It's it's a collaboration of things. So, it starts with the edit process and the review process. There's, we were talking earlier about Frame.io, which has allowed incredible collaboration, as we have people everywhere working on stories. I was probably one of the people who thought we could never not work in the office. And, we'll be the last people still in the office, during the pandemic. And, we figured it out in a week thanks to an incredible collaboration of technologies that are, start with us with Premiere and Frame.io and Dropbox and ENPS. I see Brian's out. We use all of these things to make it happen.
Sarah?
I don't know if you'd call it a technology, but to me, the thing that seems to be driving innovation and how we're able to create content is the size of our cameras and all the different types of things we can do with them. There's not a person in my newsroom who can't create some kind of content by whipping out a phone, and the quality of those cameras just continues to get better and better. So I think a lot of innovation will continue to be driven by our smartphones.
Sam?
So specific to the format of the newscast, I think the piece that's been exciting, I think panelists have certainly seen this, is the ability to collect the data from the viewer and knowing what engagement looked like, knowing what audience looked like, knowing what that time on site looked like, and being able to glean that data and then bring that all the way back to the producers and to those who are actually creating the content to make better decisions of knowing how they're engaging with the audience. So it's that think of that virtual playlist, the either dynamic manifest or however that's being done. For us, it's pretty simple dynamic manifest, in HLS. But being able to get that data about how the viewer is connecting with the content.
Meredith?
So I think our greatest value in this crowded media space is our ability to be live at a moment's notice when big news is happening, when an important event in the community is going on. And to that end, we're focused a lot on virtual production control rooms. There's been a ton of advancement in just live capability, but giving the newsroom the hands and the ability to get live on any platform with a virtual production control room is what we're focused on now.
Socrates?
Yeah, we believe in the same thing. But I think, a transformative technology is the use of AI in a newsroom. Like, what is the role of AI in a newsroom, specifically as it pertains to like data, whether as it pertains to like story writing? I feel like our jobs, or at least my job in particular, I think is to kind of help remove barriers that we're all experiencing in a newsroom, especially in larger markets where we're producing a ton of news every single day. And talk to any of our journalists across the country and the pressures that they feel every day. I can guarantee you they may not on a regular basis think that this business is fun or very rewarding. And so I think our jobs are to figure out how we can utilize technology to make their jobs easier so that what we do day in and day out can be fun again, and that everybody that's part of this big storytelling process goes home, and at the end of the day, when their head hits the pillow, they feel really satisfied with the work that they're doing because they're helping change the communities that we serve for the better. And I think that, leveraging technologies like AI and figuring out specifically like pulling in consumer data, pulling in, data that what our communities are talking about, and also having those AIs analyze the content that we're producing today and pulling in all the content data that we're getting from all the different platforms of how that's performing, so that when we start our day, it shouldn't be a question about what we should be covering, because we already have a plethora of this data, and we're literally making and spending the majority of our time making content decisions and focusing on how we can differentiate from our competition, but more importantly, to help our viewers and create better communities.
Excellent. Well, that is unfortunately all the time. We've actually gone over our time, so I would like to thank once more Micah Gelman, Sarah Burke, Sam Peterson, Meredith McGinn, and Socrates Lozano for being here. I'm going to ask you all to stay for just a moment, but let's please give them a round of applause for some excellent ideas. If you can just sit tight for a second, because we have TV News Check's publisher and co-founder Kathy Haley, who is here with Rick Young of LTN.
Rick is a familiar face to many of you. He's the Senior Vice President and Head of Product at LTN, no longer LTN Global. And Rick, LTN works with a lot of media companies that produce live sports and live news. What are your customers talking about and asking you for 2023?
Thanks. Well, good morning, everybody. And first, it was a great panel. Thank you all for that. I learned a few nuggets during that conversation. What folks are asking us about or talking to us about, there are a couple themes that actually came up in this panel. Both Socrates and Meredith mentioned a couple things that really stuck out. Socrates mentioned the need for keeping technology out of the way, right? Being creative first. And so we hear a lot of that, especially when it comes to live content. So the ability to bring in a myriad of live sources, put them in front of the journalists, the editorial teams, the folks making decisions, so they can then drive live content, live material to various platforms, right? So, but not doing it in a way that's complicated. Call the feed room, what format, how do I transcode this to that? Not thinking about that, but just giving folks simple, easy to use tools to drive content wherever it's needed. That's number one. And then the second one was the point that Meredith was talking about right at the top. She mentioned, I think it was 15 channels across the NBC portfolio of live channels. We're doing that a lot, right? Taking an existing investment in content, whether it's the main channel or all of this amazing LX programming, and CBS is doing the same thing as well, and driving unique versions of that main channel to different platforms, right? Whether that's Hulu, whether that's fast channels, whether that's your owned and operated digital channels, sort of thinking in terms of programming platforms specifically, but not only platforms. We're also having a lot of conversations where news organizations, both sort of national thinking regionally or local stations thinking on a hyper-local basis, how do I program channels in a linear fashion that looks like what television's always looked like, but uniquely programmed for region. So hyper-local channels in the case of a local market, or regional channels in the case of a national news organization. So we're spending a lot of time doing just that. I mean, we're working with one owned and operated broadcast group where they're creating three distinct flavors of unique channels for specific platforms. The ones I mentioned before, Hulu, Roku, fast channels, and owned and operated digital. So that's really the theme, and that's really what we're having a lot of conversations about. This panel's quite reassuring because that was much of what the theme of that conversation was.
Thanks, Rick Young. I know you have to catch a flight, but you have lots of people here. They're easy to find. They're in the back of the room. Thank you, Michael.